Hello everyone, welcome to my Instagram live. I'm very excited today that I'm going to be having as my guest Patrick McKeown, the renowned author of The Oxygen Advantage, and we're going to be talking today about his new book, Breathing for Yoga. Let me just see if he's sent me a request to join. Okay, so here we go. Let's see. Here we go. Oxygen Advantage has joined. And where are you, Patrick? Yes. Hi.
Hello, Mark. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Good, good.
Good.
I
Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. And I believe I was only chatting to Ruth there. She said you're in Bali.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
We're
it's
very
5
envious
p.m.
of you.
here. Yeah, it's probably a bit warmer here than there.
It is. I'll show you. Do you want to see? Do you?
Sure.
This is our own. This is our own little. This is our own studio. So this is the typical Irish weather now, at 9 a.m. in December.
Gloomy, dark and gloomy.
And grey. So yeah. So that's why breathing exercises are very important this side of the world.
100%. I think everywhere breathing
Everywhere.
exercises are important.
For sure.
So I was thinking we should just dive into it. So, I've got your book. I've got about 50 pages to go. It's like 525 pages long. So I'm almost done, but I've got through the main part of it, I would say.
Well done. Well done.
Yeah.
It's always difficult. I think it's easier to write a shorter book than a longer book. And sometimes you don't know what to leave in and sometimes you don't know what to leave out. But what I really want to do is to try and show that we were bringing breathing to yoga, but really bringing the science aspect of it and supporting it with the references. And I think that's really, really important.
That's very important, which is what I want to dive into today. As I've been preparing for this conversation, I've been rereading the book and then just realizing like we could pretty much open any page and just ask a question from there. There's just so much there for everybody, I feel like. But what I'd like to start with is what are some of the most common myths about breathing?
I think the biggest one is the importance of taking a full breath. The importance during rest and during light physical movement of having to take a full deep breath. In other words, maximizing tidal volume.
Yeah.
And this is only a relatively new idea. It was only when I started, we knew something was off. And I know from working with breathing for 22 years that when we actually had people underbreathe, and that's how I got into it, I always had cold hands and cold feet.
Mm-hmm.
And back in 1998, I deliberately underbreathed to reduce the volume of air that I was breathing. And that in turn created an air hunger, which signifies that the gas carbon dioxide has accumulated a little in the lungs and blood. And my blood vessels started dilating, my hands started getting warm.
Mm-hmm.
I never realized that, it was until then that I had a belief also that if you take this full big breath, that it improves your blood circulation and oxygen delivery.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that that's not correct. In actual fact, the opposite is true. And I don't think the yogis got this wrong, Mark. I genuinely will say that the original breathing in yoga, they absolutely nailed it. But what happened was that the message got lost. And I think the message got lost in around 1880 with what was called a hygienic movement here in Europe. People were dying with tuberculosis. It's a lung condition, well, it's affecting the lungs. And an idea took root that if you took this full big breath and aerated all of the regions of the lungs, that germs wouldn't spread so easily. And of course, India at the time was under the control of the British Empire. So it may be that information then spread from Europe to India and changed how breathing then was looked upon in India. But it only happened in 1880. Now, you might say, like, where did I get the information from? I was lucky enough to meet a person called Magdalena Crawler, and she's had just completed a PhD thesis on yoga breath, and it was her that drew that information. So it's almost as if you sense there's something not right, but you don't know why. And then she came together. Now, I was also lucky enough to meet Robin Rottenberg maybe 10 years ago. Robin was here. She is still a very experienced yoga instructor for wellness in the United States. I think she was been practicing for 30 years. And she then wrote a book, Restoring Prana. So it was her experience as well. So it's kind of little things along the journey that, brings it together. But yeah, what's the biggest myth? The biggest myth is the more air you breathe, the more oxygen that's delivered throughout the body. That's the myth.
Yes. And it's so common still. I mean, there's so many influencers you see every day still teaching people, the more you breathe, the more you're going to oxygenate your blood, the more oxygen you're going to get, And there's a guy here in Bali who has more than 1 million followers, and he teaches this type of like hyperventilation before sleep as a way to oxygenate the body. I mean, okay, maybe it does help you get to sleep. I don't want to challenge that, but at least
I don't know if it would, Mark. I don't know if it would, Hyperventilation is a stressor.
Yeah.
And it's going to cause arousal of the central nervous system. And we also know, like none of this information is new. That's the thing with it. Like there was a paper written back in 1988 by two authors, Somnian and Balestrino, and they spoke about the brain, by controlling breathing, regulates its own excitability. And it regulates its own excitability by the volume of air we breathe. So can you imagine then, just before you go to sleep, if you are doing a period of hyperventilation and you're blowing off a lot of carbon dioxide, now your brain cells are going to be firing all over the place. So I don't know if it is the right thing to do, but I suppose what's the thing about breathing and with yoga? It's not always a one size fits all either, but at the same time, we should have a basic foundation that whenever we're giving a breathing instruction, that the instructor who's giving the guidance should know the basic physiology that's happening. Otherwise, they could cause harm. Breathing is powerful.
Sure. And I mean, that's why in all those yoga texts, they say trying to tame the prana is like trying to tame a wild elephant, something like this, You have to proceed with caution. Actually, one of the reasons why I've been so drawn to your work is because one of my mentors, have you met Simon Borg-Olivier?
We've exchanged emails. Okay. I think we've exchanged WhatsApps as well. Simon would know this stuff too.
Yeah, so he was teaching this back in the late 90s when I was learning from him all this stuff about the Bohr effect, his whole, less is more. But people didn't believe him, because in the yoga world, it was taught you had to take these big ujjayi breaths. When I first started practicing Ashtanga yoga, like you would walk into the room and the room would be almost shaking with, the way people were breathing, which is so loud and so deep. And that was kind of considered to be the right way to breathe. And the reasoning, the rationale was you were oxygenating the body.
Do you know?
It was also for focusing the mind. It was a technique for mind control, to be listening to the breath instead of listening to your thoughts. But one of the main things was that you were oxygenating the body.
I think you made a really good point there. The Western mind is lively at the best of times. And it was possible that one way to help the Western mind to have some degree of stillness is to focus on the breath, but not just focus on the breath, exaggerate the breath so that it was easier to focus on, to take attention out of the mind. Now, there is a role, of course, for hyperventilation, acute hyperventilation, or controlled, maybe I use the word controlled hyperventilation, as a stressor.
You think in the book you call it voluntary
Yes.
hyperventilation. Yeah.
Yes. So controlled hyperventilation, once the individual knows what they are looking towards. And for me, the easiest way to make a comparison with breathing is to think of it the same way as physical exercise. And, you know, say a yoga student goes to a yoga instructor, and the yoga student is a beginner, and the yoga student is going through various poses, and that student is getting out of breath quite easy. It's really important to look at that student's breathing and to bear in mind that that student, because they have over or disproportionate breathlessness, it's likely to have a dysfunctional breathing pattern.
Mm-hmm.
The issue with that student is not to get them to hyperventilate. The real issue with that student is, let's correct the foundational breathing. Let's get their functional breathing right from a number of different dimensions. Because, and it comes back to the point that you made, yogis of old, and I don't know much about yoga. I didn't write the yoga part of it. I only wrote the breathing part of it. Anastasis Tanzi, who's a yoga instructor in London, he wrote the yoga part of it. But from what I could gather, yogis were quite conservative in terms of the progression of their student. They would start them off very, very gently, and then they would build them up. But we should be doing that today. We should look at people and think of it the same way as physical exercise. There's some people that you need to start walking. Some people can fast walk, some people can jog, some people can run, some people can sprint. Not everybody can sprint. Controlled hyperventilation is a sprint, but some of these people need to walk, and breathing is the same.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that just brings up that there you're talking about the biomechanics, right? You should make sure that the biomechanics of their breathing is correct or functional, as you say, or not dysfunctional.
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, there's 3 pillars pretty much to the oxygen advantage approach, right? There's the understanding the biochemistry, the biomechanics, and the effect on the nervous system.
And that's in functional breathing. So we would see there's 2 main pillars. We have get your everyday breathing right first. This is your foundation. Okay. How are you breathing every day? And then we do stressor breathing exercises over here. So we do long breath holds to lower blood oxygen saturation as stressors.
So and this would be like breath training.
I would see probably it's all really kind of breath training, but I suppose it's knowing where to start. Now, we have the biomechanical dimension, which is focusing on whether the person is breathing high or whether they are breathing low. And many people are breathing high. You know, one recent study that was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, I think in 2022, they looked at 1,933 athletes, and 90% of those had dysfunctional breathing from a biomechanical point of view. They were breathing high. In other words, they didn't have optimal recruitment of the diaphragm. Then we have to ask the question, well, why are these individuals breathing high? And bearing in mind, these people are athletes. And you would think because they are physically fit that they would have good breathing, but that's not the case. How you breathe during sports is determined by how you breathe in your everyday breathing. And it's the same as going to go with yoga. So there are many students, because of life stresses and other factors, and it will cause their breathing and can cause it to be upper chest. And the wonderful role of the yoga instructor is not just to be bringing people through the asanas, but also using the asanas as a means of training both the breath and the mind, but directed training. In other words, a targeted approach according to the needs of the student that's in front of them. So a couple of points I'd like to make on the biomechanics. If we breathe through our mouth persistently outside and off the mat, mouth breathing while walking, mouth breathing while rest, mouth breathing while sleeping. Breathing through the mouth engages the upper chest straight off, and breathing through the mouth activates a fight or flight response. And the other thing that will activate upper chest breathing is when the individual feels that they are not getting enough air. So two main factors of causing poor breathing from a biomechanical point of view is persistent mouth breathing and when the individual feels that they are not getting enough air. When you feel that you're not getting enough air, that's because your breathing is off from a biochemical point of view. So this would be the stuff that Simon Borg was talking about in terms of if you were overly sensitive to the accumulation of carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is the primary stimulus to breathe, the signaling from the brain is quite strong. So your breathing then is faster and harder. And it's ironic, the person with poor breathing is often breathing too much air, and at the same time, they still feel that they are not getting enough air. Now, when you feel that you're not getting enough air, you will naturally go to chest breathing to try and compensate for that feeling of suffocation. So now if we have a yoga student or any student coming in, and that person is breathing in the upper chest, there's two things that we need to address in their everyday breathing. One is to make sure that they are breathing both in and out through the nose during rest, during light physical exercise, and during sleep. That will automatically begin the process of better recruitment of the diaphragm. The second thing is to improve their breathing from a biochemical dimension, that they have a higher tolerance of carbon dioxide. Then their breathing is slower, lighter, nose breathing. They don't feel that air hunger, and it will be easier to breathe with good recruitment of the diaphragm. Now, you could say the opposite. You could say, well, let's target the diaphragm first, because when you breathe with good recruitment of the diaphragm, you are breathing slower. That could be one approach. However, I would have to ask what would be the long-term success if that student continues mouth breathing in a fast and shallow pattern. So it's kind of, it all ties in. So breathing it's kind of complex and simple at the same time. It's not just one thing.
I think, and there's a lot of it comes down to the language used can be confusing for a lot of people.
Yes.
For example, let's talk about taking a deep breath, right? So
yes,
this is the instruction that's so often given, like take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, or take a deep breath in and through the mouth, or deep breath out through the mouth. So people might think that because they've heard you say this is this is incorrect instruction or bad instruction. So I've actually was listening to one podcast where they were critiquing your method,
right.
And they were saying that you advocate shallow breathing because you don't like deep breathing, which means that you advocate shallow breathing. And so they've misunderstood your message.
Totally.
Could you talk on that a little bit?
Totally. Yeah. I'd love to watch that actually. Yeah. When we do breathing from a biochemical dimension, I don't focus on the diaphragm. So some of the exercise that we use are deliberately about under breathing. When I'm focusing on that, I only focus on one thing, and that's about breathing less air. We reduce either the respiratory rate and or the tidal volume to reduce the volume of air that we are taking into our lungs. The purpose of that is to help improve breathing from a biochemical dimension. During that exercise, the individual may be breathing shallow, but the purpose of that exercise is to improve breathing from a biochemical dimension. It's not
by
that we
increasing the tolerance of carbon dioxide.
Correct. Then so we focus on that and we don't worry about the diaphragm, because if you try and breathe functionally with good recruitment of the diaphragm and at the same time look to improve your breathing from a biochemical dimension, it can be a little bit tricky and it's confusing for the student. So normally if I'm focusing on one, especially with a beginner student, I'll hone in on breathing from a biochemical dimension. Let's improve your tolerance to carbon dioxide. Why is that important? Because with a higher tolerance to carbon dioxide, your breathing naturally reverts to normal. You have a normal respiratory rate, a normal tidal volume, normal gas exchange, and good vasodilation, good blood circulation, good oxygen delivery throughout the body. With that, then, after improving the biochemical...
which ties into the Bohr effect, right?
Correct, yeah. Correct. And we need actually, we'll tease out the Bohr effect in a second. Yeah. So coming back to the people who are doing a critique, so let's improve breathing from a biochemical dimension. When we get that right, or at least semi-right, and we're working on it, then we move on to the biomechanical dimension. And all the biomechanical dimension means is that we have that as the diaphragm. So basically, when we think about how we breathe, we have neurons in the brain which are not spying on our breathing. They are regulating carbon dioxide, blood pH, and to a lesser extent oxygen. And of that, carbon dioxide and blood pH are the primary stimulants to breathe. When carbon dioxide increases, blood pH drops. There's a signal sent from a very primitive part of the brain stem, and there's a signal sent via the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm breathing muscle. And during rest, the diaphragm breathing muscle moves down by about 2 to 3 centimeters, and the intercostal muscles at the side will pull out. This enlarges the thorax, so the chest cavity gets bigger, which creates a vacuum inside the chest, which draws air into the lungs. Now, as the diaphragm is moving downwards during inspiration, we should have good movement at the sides, movement at the front, and movement at the back. That's a deep breath. But a deep breath doesn't have to be a big breath. If we look at normal tidal volume, it's a half a litre. That's what normal is. But if you ask somebody to take a deep breath, you could be breathing 3 litres. Now, you can imagine teaching a yoga class and you're cueing students to slow down their breathing to 6 breaths per minute because you know that this is a really nice breathing rate in terms of bringing balance to the autonomic nervous system. You're asking your students to breathe in 2, 3, 4, 5, out 2, 3, 4, 5. One student may be breathing very lightly, very, very subtle, soft, slow, and prolonged. One student might be taking in a full breath over the course of that 5 seconds in and 5 seconds out. And one student may be breathing proportionately. All 3 students have followed the cue, breathing in for 5 and out for 5. But the breathing of student A, who was breathing light, is very different to the breathing of student B, who was taking the full big breath, and that in turn is different to the person who is breathing proportionately. And that's always an issue with focusing on the respiratory rate. Like sometimes I say to my own students coming in is like, think of the way we eat food. You know, you have a plate in front of you and there's food on that plate. That's the volume of food that you are going to eat. How you eat that food, you might use a spoon or a fork. The number of spoonfuls is the respiratory rate. The size of the spoon is the tidal volume. So the number of spoonfuls by the size of the spoon will determine the volume of food that you've eaten off the plate. What's the most important thing here? It's not the number of spoonfuls. It's not the size of the spoon. It's the volume of food that you eat off the plate. With breathing, when we look at breathing from a biochemical point of view, it's not necessarily the respiratory rate, it's not the tidal volume, but it's minute ventilation that we need to look at. And yeah, it's just one of those things. There's often a very much, and that's another myth, by the way, a myth
Sorry,
that.
can I jump
Sure,
in there
of
for a
course.
sec before I forget? Because I just want to tie this in for the yoga practitioners who are listening out there, because this struck me when I was reading the book. I was like, okay, this makes sense in this from the point of view of all the pranayamas are taught with these ratios, like 1-4-2 or whatever, you know, like in what you're saying, breathing in for 5 and out for 5, or these different ratios, but nobody's talking about the volume of air taken in on each breath. So as you're
Yes.
describing here, person A who's breathing light is maybe hypoventilating, breathing less air than normal. And the person who's being taught thinking they have to take these big breaths is hyperventilating, breathing more than normal. And this is totally going to change the effect on the person's biochemistry.
That's it.
And this is
That's it.
not talked about often when ratios in pranayama are described or prescribed.
but I think it was originally, because when you look
Yeah.
at the description, the yogi was measuring the hardness of the breath via the airflow coming from the nose, and they were measuring it by finger widths. A very light breath. You're breathing so
Hmm.
light that the air is not going to go so far out. You might only have 1 or 2 finger widths. So light. But if you have a hard breath in, a full breath in, you are going to be breathing all of that air out, and you might be breathing 4 or 5 finger widths. So the original yogi did look at the tidal volume, but they looked at it slightly different. But that has got
Yeah.
forgotten about.
Sorry, and yeah, I interrupted you. You were going to say one other myth. You might have
Yeah,
forgotten now.
the other myth is always the sole focus on the respiratory rate. Like if you look at
Right.
most breathing
Yeah.
modalities, and very
Yeah.
often, and look at all of the work with heart rate variability over the last 30 years,
Okay. Yeah.
there's very much a focus on the respiratory rate and
Yeah.
no focus whatsoever on the minute volume. Now, it's probably because it's difficult enough to measure minute volume, and it is, but if you're a breathing instructor working with your students, you can cue your students, breathe slow. That means you're focusing on slowing down the respiratory rate, breathing less breaths per minute, but also breathe light. And even if you were just to cue to your students, breathe in and out through your nose, but also breathe with silent breathing. And there would be a huge difference in a yoga class that's taught by a yoga instructor that is cueing their students to have nose and silent breathing throughout the class. Because that class, all students who are following that instruction in that class will be also improving their breathing from a biochemical dimension. And what's the importance of this? When we breathe a little bit less air, we can dilate 50,000 miles of blood vessels throughout the body. When I'll give you this example here. If you were doing an asana and you're feeling a tolerable air hunger, you're breathing nose and you're breathing light, and because of the physical movement, of course, the demands of oxygen is increased, the production of carbon dioxide is increased. But if you can maintain nose and light breathing and silent breathing during that, carbon dioxide in the blood will increase by about 3 to 4 millimeters of mercury. And every 1 millimeter increase of CO2 will improve blood flow to the brain by 3%. So you could be a yoga instructor teaching your student to have nose and light and silent breathing. And during that class, that student will experience up to a 10% increase of blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain simply by changing the instruction. And that's all one has to do. I would love to see today that anybody who is involved in teaching breathing, that it's not just about training for the physical body, but it's really about training for the breath. But more importantly, it's about training for the brain. It's not just about training for the brain and having directed attention onto the breath, but it's about changing the physiology. It's about improving blood flow and oxygen delivery. Because if we think of the human brain is 2% of our body weight, but it consumes 20% of our oxygen. We really need to fuel it. And it's through our breathing that we can fuel the brain. And we have 80 billion brain cells. Each brain cell is communicating with 15,000 other brain cells. But if we are in a habit of breathing too much air, that in turn will lower carbon dioxide, increase blood pH, causes arousal of the central nervous system, and it will increase brain cell excitability. So coming back to that 1988 paper, the brain, by regulating breathing, regulates its own excitability. Now, I had written about that paper back in 2010. I wrote a book, Anxiety Free. I love mindfulness, but I don't think it's enough, because if somebody has dysfunctional breathing and poor sleep, they naturally have an agitation of the mind because of the physiological effect that it's putting them into a stress response. And when you are in that physiologically stressed response because of poor sleep and dysfunctional breathing, it's quite difficult to be observant of the breath or the body or the mind. So I wanted to bring together observation of the breath, mindfulness, with functional breathing patterns. Bring the two in together. So I wrote a book on that. And then I'd forgotten about, the book is still out there, of course, but I was listening to a podcast by Dr. Andrew Huberman, and he started talking about carbon dioxide. And then he started talking about that quotation. The brain by regulating breathing, the brain by controlling breathing regulates its own excitability. And I said, I know that quote. And I went back to the book and I said, there it was. Now it's starting to become mainstream. So Simon Borg was correct. Back in the 1990s, nobody believed him. I know that because I've been teaching since 2002 and full time with breathing. And it wasn't that just, there was a kind of, I wouldn't say resistance, but I would say disinterest. People didn't get it.
Yeah.
That the more air you breathe, the more you are depriving your body of oxygen. The more air you breathe, in time, you are reducing your tolerance to carbon dioxide, which in turn can lead you to breathing too much air all of the time. Now, that is a problem because if you're breathing too much air all of the time, it is going to reduce oxygen delivery throughout the body. It is going to cause your blood vessels to constrict. It is going to cause you into an increased stress response. It is going to cause you to have disproportionate breathlessness during physical exercise. These are the students on the mat who are getting overly breathless during the asanas. And that's why targeting their breathing from a biochemical dimension is important.
Can we just look at, talk about pH for a moment?
Yes.
So carbon dioxide, as that builds up, that increases the acidity in the body. So that lowers pH. And when you hyperventilate and you blow off carbon dioxide, that increases alkalinity.
Yes.
Correct?
Correct.
What I want to know is, do you think that diet can affect pH? Because that used to be what was taught, at least like Simon used to teach that. If you have an alkaline diet, then you could tolerate more carbon dioxide. So you could do longer breath holds for you in your pranayama practice.
I think he was right in certain, and I actually included Simon in the book, The Oxygen Advantage. Exactly what you said there. I think he was right. It's just that the primary regulator of blood pH is not the food that we eat. The primary regulator of blood pH is our breathing and carbon dioxide. Now, and if you talk to nutritionists, I'm not sure if it's fully known the impact that the food that we eat is having on the blood pH, because of course, the stomach acid and everything else. Now, in some ways, though, I would say for sure that people who was eating a light diet in terms of vegetables, fruits, etc., which may be considered a more alkaline diet, has definitely less of an impact on breathing. But if we go for a sugary diet or stimulants or alcohol, that does stimulate our breathing. So the food and drink that we consume does have an impact on breathing. And the one researcher, Dr. Weston Price, he wrote a book back in the 1930s called Physical and Nutrition. Yeah, Physical and Nutritional Degeneration, or Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. He went around to various civilizations. He went to the Maoris, the Aborigines, Swiss people, Gaelic people off the Hebrides Islands, and he asked, what happens to these people when they switch from a normal diet over to a processed diet? On the Hebrides Islands off the coast of Scotland, first generation children became mouthbreathers as a result of the transition from the normal foods that they were eating, fish, oatmeal, the traditional foods, and once those kids switched over to the sugary foods, they became mouthbreathers. The shape of their jaws changed. They had overcrowding of teeth, they had more dental cavities, and there was a lot going on there. So there's definitely a connection between the food that we are eating and how we breathe. But coming back to blood pH, the human body wants homeostasis, and blood pH is normally 7.365, 7.4. Now, we are very sensitive to an accumulation of carbon dioxide. If you did a maximum breath hold, your carbon dioxide might increase by about 10 millimeters of mercury. That will increase blood pH, but only slightly. Sorry, that will decrease blood pH. It will increase acidity, but only people often think that, well, if I underbreathe or if I do a breath hold, it's going to cause acidity in the blood. Only slight and only for an intermittent period of time. The difference is if you hyperventilate, it's very easy to get rid of carbon dioxide. If you did 30 full big breaths and then you waited a minute and then 30 full big breaths again and waited a minute and did 30 full big breaths again, you can increase your blood pH to as high as 7.75. Now, we die at 7.8. So it's a lot easier to drive up blood pH than it is to lower blood pH. And the reason being is because the body is very sensitive to accumulation of carbon dioxide. So it is often a question that comes up. And it's a tricky enough subject because the thing about carbon dioxide is that not everybody with dysfunctional breathing has low CO2. Because breathing isn't just looking at it from a biochemical dimension. Breathing is multi-dimensional. Now, there is an interconnectedness between the different dimensions, and what researchers currently look at now is they look at the biochemical dimension, the biomechanical dimension, and the psychophysiological dimension. But there's more dimensions, but researchers haven't decided on them. You know, like there has to be a dimension between the impact of breathing on the immune system and the feedback of the immune system and breathing. There's also an impact of breathing, okay, with the central nervous system as a psychophysiological. But let's look at it this way. We use both score as a measurement of a person's functional breathing patterns. We have the person breathe in and out and hold their breath, and they time it in seconds until they feel the first definite desire to breathe. That gives us a good reflection of how well that person is breathing. It is an indirect measurement of the chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide, but if a person has a low BOLT score, they typically have dysfunctional breathing patterns. Now, there is a relationship between a low BOLT score, which implies that you have a strong chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide, and baroreflex sensitivity. And I don't want to go too deep here, but the baroreceptors are pressure receptors in our major blood vessels, and they are continuously monitoring our blood pressure. If our blood pressure increases, the baroreceptors should be sensitive enough to pick up on this and send a signal via the brain to the blood vessels to dilate and the heart rate to slow down to normalize our blood pressure. And conversely, if our blood pressure goes too low, these pressure receptors should pick up on our blood pressure going too low and send a signal via the brain for the blood vessels to constrict and the heart rate to increase to normalize blood pressure. There is a connection between our breathing and the baroreflex sensitivity. If we have a strong chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide, our breathing is harder and faster. This implies that we have reduced baroreflex sensitivity. We are more vulnerable to adverse cardiovascular health. And this, in turn, the baroreflex sensitivity feeds into the balance of the autonomic nervous system. So a person with a low BOLT score having a strong chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide, in turn is having a reduced baroreflex sensitivity, and their autonomic nervous system is in an increased sympathetic drive. And that's why the biochemical dimension is very, very important. And we have to say, well, how then can we really be targeting breathing from a biochemical dimension? It's very, very simple. Don't overbreathe. Breathe in and out through your nose, and use your yoga and your physical training and your breathing during rest, that there's times that you're deliberately under breathing to deliberately increase CO2, because when you breathe less air, the carbon dioxide that's coming back to the lungs doesn't leave the lungs so quickly enough. So by breathing less air, that carbon dioxide then will accumulate in the small little air sacs in the lungs, the alveoli. As carbon dioxide accumulates in the small air sacs in the lungs, only a little, it in turn will increase CO2 in the blood leaving the lungs. So now we have slightly higher CO2 in the blood, and by exposing the brain to this slightly higher CO2 and drop to blood pH, the body reduces the chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. So it's really interesting how, you know, as a human body, everything is interconnected. And yeah, it's the basic understanding of it.
Yeah, as you're talking, there's so many little, trails I want to go down with all of that. So it reminded me something we haven't talked about is nitric oxide. And because actually it was funny, recently I was in Sydney and I bought a soup and it was advertising, increase your nitric oxide. And I was
What
like,
was it
what's
made
the
of?
ingredient?
Beets or something, was it?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I thought, man, this is the effect that Patrick has had
No,
on
no,
the
no, it's
world.
not. No, do you know, if you think about, I made a mistake with nitric oxide originally. Like when I was writing the book, The Oxygen Advantage, it's going back 10 years ago when I started writing it,
Yeah.
And like nitric oxide is this wonderful gas. It was considered to be a molecule of the year in 1992. It was only discovered on the exhale breath of the human being in 1991. So it's a pretty recent discovery in terms of human health. There's nitric oxide that's produced locally in the nose and also in the air pockets, the sinuses surrounding the nasal airway, the nasal cavity. And it's by breathing. So this nitric oxide is being produced continuously. And it's only by breathing through the nose that we actually harness this nitric oxide. And we carry this nitric oxide into our lungs. And nitric oxide in the lungs will open up the airways. So you can imagine the two bronchi, and then they're subdividing into 23 branches of airways. The medium and the smaller airways, they bronchodilate as a result of taking this nitric oxide into the lungs. But nitric oxide will also sterilize the incoming air. And that's very important in terms of viruses and what we've just gone through with COVID. Health authorities were talking about wash your hands and wear a mask. Who was talking about breathing through the nose, in and out through the nose? Who was talking about even breathing lightly? And even if somebody was infected, they still should have been breathing in and out through the nose. I was talking about this at the time, and it's kind of weird that it's just the whole thing about the nose was still overlooked. You can imagine somebody who was infected with COVID. They're feeling breathless. It did affect the chest. And because of the feeling and the sensation of air hunger, they may revert to mouth breathing because it's easier. But now they are mouth breathing. COVID was spread via the water particles, but there's a 42% greater water loss breathing out through the mouth. So a person who was infected with a respiratory issue, with a virus, if they mouth breathe, it's more likely to be putting that out into the environment than if they were nose breathing, because the nose recovers the heat and moisture. But anyway, coming back to nitric oxide,
Yeah.
sterilizes the
Actually,
incoming air.
before I forget, and maybe we can look back to also the one thing that COVID brought us awareness to was the pulse oximeter,
Yes,
right? Which measuring the oxygen saturation in the blood. So maybe we can talk about that, because I think there was
yes.
a lot of confusion as to what was actually the correct, or what you were looking for there.
Right. Sure.
Yeah, but let's go
So,
back first of all, the nitric oxide. Yeah.
so this wonderful gas, nitric oxide, when we breathe through the nose, the nitric oxide that we carry into our lungs is isolated to the lungs. So the nitric oxide from the nose, we have to think about the nose and the throat and the lungs, the diaphragm. It's one airway. Whatever happens in the upper airways will travel down to the lower, and vice versa. As we breathe in through the nose, we're carrying this nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is also helping to dilate the small little blood vessels that are surrounding the capillaries. And it's known since 1988 that when you continuously breathe through your nose, that the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood increased by nearly 10% during rest. That probably is down to nitric oxide. Also, with breathing nitric oxide, it helps to redistribute the blood throughout the lungs, so there's a better gas exchange then taking place. So we think about nitric oxide as an aerocrine messenger. It plays some role in sleep, although it's not fully understood. It helps to open up the airways. It helps to open up the blood vessels in the lungs for a better gas exchange to take place. It sterilizes the incoming air, and it redistributes the blood throughout the lungs. And that's just by breathing through the nose and harnessing that simple gas. Now let's look at yogi and also the practices that originated from the East over time. Humming and the
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
meditations that involved humming, which will produce nitric oxide up to 16-fold in the nose. Breath holding as part of yoga, but breathing out and holding the breath And as you breathe out and hold your breath, carbon dioxide is accumulating in the nasal airway. Then you let go of your nose, you breathe in, you breathe in, you breathe out, you hold your nose, nitric oxide is accumulating in the nasal airway. Then you let go, you breathe into your lungs, you're carrying that nitric oxide laden air into the lungs. So it's a wonderful gas. Now, there is a difference between the nitric oxide in the respiratory system and the nitric oxide in the blood vessels. So the soup that you were eating is designed to help stimulate the production of nitric oxide in the blood vessels through the food that we eat. Moderate physical exercise will do the same. Yoga, of course, will do the same. So two differences. And I made a mistake in the book, The Oxygen Advantage, because I said when you breathe through your nose, that nitric oxide is going to pass from the lungs into the blood circulation, but it's a very short-lived gas, so it's likely it doesn't.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. So interesting. So let's, can we talk a little bit about that, the blood, the oxygen saturation? Because at that
Yes.
time, during COVID, it was like, oh, you needed to have like a blood oxygen saturation of like 98% or 99%. If it was anything lower, people were thinking that you were sick, which I later found out actually it was not a real indicator of whether the oxygen is getting into the cells. Is that correct? Am I
Yeah,
misunderstanding that?
we can tease it out a
Yeah,
little bit. So
yeah,
basically, as we take a breath of fresh air into our lungs, oxygen is going to pass through a very thin wall from the lungs into the blood vessels. And oxygen in the blood itself is relatively insoluble. So only about 1.5% of the oxygen that we carry in the blood is dissolved in the plasma. So the blood, it needs a carrier, and that carrier is hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a protein within the red blood cell that carries the vast amount of oxygen. So you can imagine we take a breath of fresh air into the lungs. Oxygen is passing fusing from the lungs into the blood and is being carried in the blood by hemoglobin. And this blood then is being pumped by the heart throughout the body. The pulse oximeter is measuring the fraction of your hemoglobin occupied by oxygen at the peripheries. So your pointing finger typically. You have a little device with a red light and an infrared light, and by the color that goes through, it's able to pick up on whether the hemoglobin is carrying oxygen or not. Of all of your hemoglobin, normal blood oxygen saturation is that 95 to 99% of your hemoglobin is carrying oxygen. That would be considered normal. Now, say, for example, there's a problem with the lungs and the airways are constricted, or they're plugged with mucus, or the small little air sacs in the lungs are damaged. The air then that you are breathing in, the oxygen, is not able to pass from the lungs into the blood. So then the blood is leaving the lungs with less oxygen. And that's why people would be concerned, especially when your blood oxygen saturation goes, say, below 93%, 92%, 91%. So there is one thing about the blood oxygen saturation is one thing. Now, the second thing that you spoke about is that hemoglobin is the carrier of oxygen. How do we encourage or assist in hemoglobin releasing that oxygen to where it's needed? Now, part of that's going to be based on the Bohr effect that you spoke about at the very start. So the Bohr effect is a physiological accepted norm by a Danish physiologist called Christian Bohr. He discovered it back in 1904. He said that as carbon dioxide pressure in the blood increases, blood pH drops, and the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen reduces. So in other words, we think of this hemoglobin as the carrier of oxygen. We don't want hemoglobin, the oxygenated blood, to do a round trip throughout the body and then come back to the lungs and we breathe out the oxygen. We don't want that. We need hemoglobin to release oxygen. Hemoglobin is released in the presence of carbon dioxide. Now, if you gently soften and slow down your breathing, and people might wonder, like, how could you underbreathe? It's so simple. And I would say for anybody to practice it. As you're sitting there, take a very, very soft, gentle breath in through your nose and a really relaxed and a slow and a gentle breath out. So the key is, instead of taking a normal breath in, take in about 80% of your breath in. Just gently soften and slow down the speed of the breath in, and then allow a really slow and relaxed and a gentle breath out. By taking a softer breath in, you're reducing tidal volume. By having a soft breath in and a really slow, relaxed, gentle breath out, you are slowing down the respiratory rate. This in turn is reducing the volume of air that you are breathing into your lungs. This in turn then is going to increase carbon dioxide in the lungs and in the blood. As carbon dioxide increases in the blood pH drops a little. Hemoglobin will start to release oxygen more readily. So this comes back to how would we know
would you do
you
that? Sorry.
could do this. For some people that I'm working with, I have them do it for 10 minutes every hour, but these people can be quite unwell and I really need to target their breathing. Typically, we would ask people to do it whenever you do your physical exercise. Don't do it with your mouth open, do it with your mouth closed. If you're doing your yoga, do it with your mouth closed, because I think yoga is such a wonderful way to do this. And all the student has to do is focus on two things: breathe in and out through their nose and breathe as silently as they can. How would you know that carbon dioxide is increasing in the blood? You will feel an increased sensation of breathlessness. And surrender to that state of increased breathlessness. Now, of course, you don't want the breathlessness to be too much to the point that you have involuntary contractions of the diaphragm. You want to experience a sensation of breathlessness, but it should be tolerable. Unless, of course, you're doing breath holding, longer breath holds and things like that. Can you imagine going in to do a yoga practice, and in that, it's impacting your 50,000 miles of blood vessels, it's increasing oxygen delivery throughout the body. Now, carbon dioxide also stimulates the vagus nerve, so there's a vagotropic effect there. You're helping to reduce the chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. So there's so much going on in terms of just making simple tweaks to breathing during a practice.
That's so, we haven't even gotten onto the vagus nerve yet, which is a whole.
Well, that's why now you see why there's 600 pages in the book, you know.
Exactly. Yeah.
And like the vagus nerve, not new, discovered back in, I think it was 1905 originally, and then further in 1913. I think it was Lowy, one individual, and what he was doing was he was stimulating the vagus nerve in a frog, and he found by stimulating the vagus nerve that the heart rate slowed down, and he called this vagus stuff. And then there was a very interesting experiment done by a neuroscientist in New York called Kevin Tracy, and he was doing experiments on rats, and he stimulated the vagus nerve in the rat, and he found that by stimulating the vagus nerve that it blocked pro-inflammatory cytokines. So these are the chemical messengers that trigger inflammation. Now, if we think of the diseases that are really affecting human beings, how many of those have a component of inflammation in them? So the vagus nerve, if we can stimulate the vagus nerve, it can help dampen the stress response. And stress and inflammation go together. So how do we counter that? Well, change our breathing pattern. And there's 3 or 4 ways. There's many ways to stimulate the vagus nerve, but from a breathing point of view, if you breathe low with good recruitment of the diaphragm, you naturally stimulate the vagus nerve. If you slow down the breath to between 4.5 and 6.5 breaths per minute at different times throughout the day, you stimulate the vagus nerve. But if you also soften the breath to the point of a tolerable air hunger, the increased carbon dioxide stimulates the vagus nerve. So I use the acronym of LSD. From a biochemical dimension, we look for light breathing. So light breathing is pretty much what the original yogis were saying. Don't breathe with 4 widths of the finger. Don't breathe so hard that the air goes so far out of your nose. Breathe subtle. Breathe prolonged. prolonged but light and subtle. That's targeting your breathing from a biochemical dimension. To target your breathing from a biomechanical dimension, which is already happening anyway, let's face it, in yoga, with the different asanas, that in turn then is stimulating the vagus nerve. So that's deep. And slow breathing is then when we alter the respiratory rate. So we want nose, light, slow, deep.
LSD.
LSD. People will remember it.
Yeah. So if we think about it, maybe we can, this as we're going to finish in 5 minutes, right? Even though
I don't mind.
I could, yeah, I could easily go on talking. I was just thinking, just you have sort of hinted towards practical ways for the listeners to apply what you're talking about. Maybe we could just go through some of those.
Yeah.
You know, just give a few like things that people can do in their daily life or in their
Yes.
yoga practice.
Yeah.
One.
So, Mark,
do you recommend everyone to do their Bolt score, or is that not necessary?
I think it's useful as a measurement. There are sometimes when I'm working with people with anxiety and panic disorder that sometimes a measurement can put a pressure on a person because they feel a compulsion to be achieving this, and it puts pressure on them, and it will hamper the very thing that they want. But at the same time, even if you were just to measure it once or twice, and it's a very simple measurement. And a recent paper by Kyle Kiesel, he's a professor of physical therapy, because the thing about breathing is, like, how do you know how well you breathe? And if you were to measure your breathing across different dimensions of breathing, it's very cumbersome. Like, if you want to look at your breathing from a biochemical dimension, you have to measure end-tidal CO2. It's an expensive enough equipment, capnography. If you want to look at your breathing from a biomechanical dimension, you do the high-low test. If you want to look at your breathing from a psychophysiological dimension, it's the Nijmegen questionnaire or the self-evaluation breathing questionnaire. But that's cumbersome. So Kyle Kiesel said, let's do one thing. And he put it to the test. He got 51 individuals, and he found out of the 51 individuals, average age of 27 years of age, only 5 of them passed breathing from all 3 dimensions. And 25% of them failed breathing from all 3 dimensions. And I think that's a fair enough figure, that 25% of the population have dysfunctional breathing. But 75% of the anxiety population, 50% of people with lower back pain, minimum is 30% of people with asthma. That's according to the literature. So what did he conclude? He concluded that if your Bolt score is greater than 25 seconds, there is an 89% chance that your breathing is functional. That's what he concluded. Now, the Bolt score is the same as the control pause from the Buteyko method, which was my training back 22 years ago. So that's why we use the Bolt score. But I would say to people, don't get hung up about it. But at the same time, you know what? See how it goes.
Do you want to just talk everyone through it right now?
I'm going to do it now, yeah. So to measure your Bolt score, take a normal breath in through your nose and out through your nose, and you pinch your nose and hold your nose, and you just relax into your body, and you're timing it in seconds. How long can you hold your breath for until you feel the first definite desire to breathe? So you keep on relaxing into the body, and you're holding your breath until you feel the first involuntary contractions of the diaphragm, the first definite desire to breathe, or the first reaction of your brain to resume breathing. But what's most importantly is that you're breathing. When you resume breathing, it should be normal. I didn't time yours, but I would say it was over 25 seconds there, Mark. So that's what we're looking for. Now, the
first time I saw you do that was with Brian Tracy on London Real.
That's going back quite a bit.
It was quite. He did quite well. I was surprised. Yeah.
But remember, we were talking about beginner yogis of old.
Yeah.
They measured experienced students by their ability to suspend their breath for a period of time. And Yogi Masters had a Bolt score of 180 seconds. So now we can say that the training in yoga back in the day was all about, even though they, of course, they didn't know the names, carbon dioxide, etc., but it was all about conservation of the breath. But in order to have conservation of the breath, you need to have a good tolerance to the accumulation of carbon dioxide. And that's what the Bose score indirectly measures. Okay. Going to start off with a very simple exercise. This is when the mind is racing, because we have to be kind of cognizant. If the mind is racing, the last thing that we want to do is meditate. So how can we help to improve blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain to help bring a calmness to the mind? Do small breath holds after an exhalation. If you breathe in and hold your breath, it's a slight stressor. But if you breathe out and hold your breath, it's a relaxer, and it stimulates the vagus nerve, and it will increase CO2 slightly. So take a normal breath in through your nose and out through your nose, and you pinch your nose and hold your nose, and you hold your breath for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let go, breathe in through your nose, and now you're just breathing normally for 10 to 15 seconds. Anytime the mind is racing, hold your breath. But hold your breath for a period of time that's comfortable for the individual at that time. I have used this with hundreds of people with panic disorder and anxiety. Hundreds. Because very often this group of people, they get anxious if they focus on their breathing. So we want to change their physiology without them having to focus on their breath. And again, normal breath in through your nose, out through your nose, pinch your nose and hold your nose. 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let go, breathe in through your nose, and then you're just breathing normal for 10 to 15 seconds. The other thing about this exercise is that as you hold your breath, nitric oxide is pooling inside your nasal airway. Then you let go. You're carrying this nitric oxide into your lungs, and it will help bronchodilate, help open up the airways in the lungs. And again, normal breath in through your nose, out through your nose, pinch your nose and hold. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let go, breathe in through your nose, and to breathe normal then for 10 to 15 seconds. Now, if people find that even holding the breath for 5 seconds is a struggle, just do it for 3 seconds. So this is meant to be a gentle exercise. And again, take a normal breath in through your nose, out through your nose, and pinch your nose and hold. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let go. Breathe in through your nose and to breathe normal for 10 to 15 seconds. I'm now going to move on to a nose unblocking exercise. So it's similar enough to what we just did. The only difference is I'm going to have you gently nod your head. By the way, for any of the listeners, don't do this if you're pregnant or if you are prone to anxiety or panic disorder or any cardiovascular disease or serious health condition. Go very, very gentle, but just don't do it if you're pregnant. So to help open up your nose, for Mark, take a normal breath in through your nose, out through your nose, pinch your nose and hold. Now gently nod your head up and down 10 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and let go and breathe in through your nose. It's known since 1923 that when you hold your breath, your nose opens up. I have to do it a few times. Mark. The next time I'm going to do it for 15 nods. So we start off easy enough and then we kind of build it up. So I'm just waiting for a few seconds for you to have normal breathing and then we will do it again. The thing about being able to open up your nose, when your nose is freer, your sleep is better. And when you feel more comfortable breathing through your nose, people do breathe through the nose. See, here's the issue. The nose gets stuffy. The person feels uncomfortable breathing through their nose. Then they breathe through their mouth, and that will only aggravate nasal congestion. The mouth does nothing when it comes to the breath. Take a normal breath in through your nose, out through your nose, pinch your nose and hold your nose, and gently nod your head up and down 15 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now you're going to be pushing at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, and let go. Now, this is not an easy breath hold. If we want to open up the nose, we want to hold our breath for a reasonable period of time to increase carbon dioxide to elicit a stress response. So at the start, it's a very easy breath hold. The Bolt score, comfortable breath hold. This is a longer breath hold, yeah? So now we're going to wait for about
This is so
15.
good for, like alternate nostril breathing, Nadi
Correct.
Shodhana. Such a good one for that, because sometimes you do that and one nostril is blocked, so it makes it more difficult.
Yes. There's 3 ways to help open up the nose. One is by breath holding. One is by doing physical exercise with the mouth closed. And in the last year, researchers found that humans having sex opens up the nose. So there's 3 ways to do it.
Okay.
Or you can go to your chemist or drugstore and you can get it over the counter, is what typically people do. But there's 3 ways of doing it. So let's go. I'm going to go for 20 now, because now I want to push you a bit, yeah? It's best if you hold your breath for at least 30 seconds, and then you feel your nose opening up. Now, this was one of the exercises that got me into breathing, and the reason being is because it worked. Quick. Take a normal breath in through your nose, out through your nose, pinch your nose and hold your nose, and 20 nods. Gentle. And bear in mind that this is a slight stressor. You will feel, or you may feel, involuntary contractions of the diaphragm. Keep relaxing into the body. Keep holding the breath. Now, I haven't been counting the head nods, so just keep on going until you feel that the air hunger is relatively strong. So now to push it, Mark, but not to overdo it. Nothing extreme. You should be able to recover within 2 breaths. So keep holding your breath, keep going, keep pushing it until it's, moderate to strong air hunger. Then let go, breathe in through your nose, and now just to breathe normal. So you will find now that that will have a stronger effect. So to open up the nose, you need to hold your breath for at least 30 seconds or so. Now, breath holding could be brought then into asanas with deliberate breath holding. So say, for example, there's a pause in the pose, and during that time, the students are holding the breath on an exhalation. But having the students hold their breath according to a moderate air hunger that they feel, not for the instructor to put out a figure, because a figure which may suit one person may not suit another. I started you off with 10 head nods.
Yeah.
I looked at your breathing. Then we said 15. We looked at your breathing. We already knew your Bolt score, so we knew you have a decent enough tolerance towards CO2. Then I could push you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But I put people
it
into
needs
panic.
to be individually prescribed.
Correct. Yeah. And also for the student to listen to their own body.
Yeah.
And if a student has a history of panic disorder or anxiety, the feeling of air hunger or suffocation can be enough to trigger them into a panic attack. So that's why I go very, very gentle. Start off with the small breath holds. And the other exercise that really got me into breathing was actually under breathing, breathing less air. Because there were only 2 exercises that did it for me personally. Now, I was using breathing exercises personally for a few years before I started training. I changed careers. So this next exercise was, you can simply put one hand on your chest, one hand just above your navel, or you could have your hands on your lap if you wanted to, but it might be easier just one hand on the chest, one hand just above the navel.
I can't see, but I'm doing that, yeah.
That's fine. And you're just tuning in on your breathing, so become aware of the breath. So you're focusing on the airflow coming into the body, and you're focusing on the airflow as it's leaving the body. And the whole purpose of this is to underbreathe. How do we breathe less air into the body? It's not about deliberately interfering with the breathing muscles or restricting your breathing or anything like that. Just focus on the airflow coming into your nose And as you feel the slightly colder air coming into your nose, slow down the speed of the air coming into the nose so that you feel less turbulence coming into your nose. There's a saying from a yoga book back in 1979. I can't remember the author of it, but the author in this book written back in 1979, he said that your breathing should be so smooth that the fine hairs within the nostrils do not move. So can your breathing be so smooth on the in-breath that you hardly feel your breathing? And then you're having a really relaxed and slow, gentle breath out. It's always about letting the air to leave the body effortlessly. So there's a passive exhalation. The diaphragm is moving back to its resting position, the ribs are moving in, and the air is leaving the body. As you're having that really relaxed and a slow and gentle breath out, it's almost that you are breathing out with relaxation. And then when you need to breathe in, you're breathing in so softly, almost that your breath in is imperceptible. So you could think of also of yogis of old. They used to use beeswax and seal both nostrils and then pull out a horsehair, and the objective was to breathe through a tiny hole that was left by the horsehair. That's conservation of the breath. So this is conservation of the breath, whereby you were deliberately under breathing. You're exposing your body to less air. By breathing less air, carbon dioxide accumulates in the lungs and blood. As carbon dioxide increases in the lungs and blood, it will dilate your blood vessels, increase oxygen delivery throughout the body, stimulate the vagus nerve, dampen the stress response, and activate the relaxation response. As you're doing this exercise, pay attention to the internal temperature of your fingers. As you're doing this exercise, pay attention to the saliva in the mouth. If we can activate the rest response, we feel sleepy. If we can activate the digest response, we have increased watery saliva in the mouth. When we do this exercise, by taking a really soft and slow, gentle breath in, and a relaxed and a slow and a gentle breath out, the body is telling the brain that the body is safe. When the brain interprets that the body is safe, we can fall asleep easy. When the brain interprets that the body is safe, we can eat food. Many of us, our breathing is fast, hard, shallow. Our body is continuously telling the brain that we are under threat. We are doing the opposite now to how we breathe during stress. Instead of breathing hard and fast and shallow, is to breathe soft, slow, light, ideally low, but just focus on at the moment, soft breath in and a really relaxed and a slow and a gentle breath out. So this could be construed as shallow breathing, but bear in mind, this exercise is only about targeting the biochemical dimension of breathing. We also have several exercises for the biomechanics of breathing, but we are just focusing in on one at the moment. So Mark, I need you to feel air hunger. I need you to feel that you're not getting enough air. I need you to feel that you would like to take in a deeper breath. And this is reflecting that carbon dioxide is increased in the blood. And as carbon dioxide is increasing in the blood, even though you feel air hunger, there is increased oxygen delivery throughout your body. But what's more, this exercise here is helping to strengthen the baroreflex, increase the pressure receptor sensitivity in the major blood vessels, which in turn will help to bring balance to the autonomic nervous system. So in terms of stimulating the vagus nerve, increasing the baroreflex sensitivity to improve heart rate variability, this exercises will do it. Take a rest. Now, it's not the easiest of exercises, because the thing is, the air hunger can be tricky to sustain, and it takes a little bit of practice. So what I would say to people is, if you want to understand about breathing, the best way to understand it, yes, have an idea of what the breathing exercise does from a scientific perspective. It's very, very important, but also experience what the exercise does. And normally when somebody practices that last exercise, they do have increased watery saliva in the mouth. It never happens 100%, but that's the normal. People feel sleepy. People feel that the temperature of their hands increase. Now, if you can increase the temperature of your hands, you know that the blood vessels in your hands have dilated. And the blood vessels have not just dilated in the hands. The blood vessels have dilated throughout the body, including the brain. So during that exercise, Mark, we would expect the blood flow to the brain to increase by about 10% just by doing that exercise.
Amazing. And that's probably one of the secrets for the yogis being able to withstand the cold, like in the mountains, right? Being able to sit in the snow or whatever, because they can keep their body temperature warm.
I think it's part of it. Now, there can be other factors, of course, going on, but we know the opposite. We know that hyperventilation, by causing arousal of the central nervous system, it can increase pain perception and it can lower pain threshold. Now, there's another thing that we probably should be talking a little bit about is female breathing, given that yoga, I'm not sure is it 50-50 men, women, but my perception is that there can be more women doing it than men.
100%, yeah. Maybe 75% even.
Hormonal changes with females is different, of course, to men because of the monthly cycle. So when we think of the female monthly cycle, we're thinking of menstruation. You have the follicular phase, proliferation, ovulation, luteal phase. So post-ovulation, mid-luteal phase, there's an increase in the hormone progesterone and estrogen. And progesterone is a respiratory stimulant. So in the latter phases of the monthly cycle, the female's breathing is going to be stimulated. And she is going to be breathing faster and harder, such that carbon dioxide in the blood can lower. And one paper suggested as much as 25%. That's going to that can feed into symptoms of fatigue, panic. Females are 2 to 3 times more likely to have panic disorder than men, anxiety, brain fog, increased pain. So the hormonal changes, and that should also be considered. So, you know, there's a time in the earlier phases of the monthly cycle that breathing is lighter and easier. And then there's a time that breathing is harder. And we should also be asking the question, should females be going easier in the earlier phases? Sorry, should they be going a little bit harder in the earlier phases and going easier in the latter phases when their breathing is stimulated? But the symptoms, one paper looked at the symptoms of PMS and asked, is this hyperventilation? In other words, are the symptoms of PMS attributable to the hyperventilation caused by the change in hormones? And the one thing is that females, of course, we all have control over our breathing. So for a female to track her BOLT score across the monthly cycle, and if she notices that, say, in the early phases, that her BOLT score is at, we'll say, 25 seconds, and then post-ovulation, mid-luteal phase, her BOLT score is 15 seconds. That's a considerable change in her breathing patterns. And now we have to consider the impact of the hormonal changes there.
Very interesting. Yeah.
So we're all different.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, I have to get going. I would love to stay and go deeper into all of this, but I need to go. Thank you very much for your time and all your insights. Yeah, we should do it again. Yeah.
Absolutely, Mark. Reach out and listen, thanks very much, because it's always good to have a conversation. You know, breathing, it's a tool that it's a tremendous tool, and I would love to see an awareness happening that people fully understand about breathing from a multidimensional point of view. I think it's amazing. Yeah.
100%. And we didn't get a chance to answer any questions, so I just thought then maybe if anyone who is listening has questions, they could put them in the comment box on my Instagram, and then we could try to address those at a later point. Yeah.
Great stuff. Yeah. Let's do it again.
Yeah, let's do it again. Thank you so much.
Mark.
Yeah, thank you. See you. Thank you.
All the best. Bye. Bye.